Aloha, aloha everybody. Jumping on now because I'm in transit from, just came from Mississippi, Jackson, Mississippi to Atlanta, Georgia, at the airport. And gonna head home to Honolulu in a couple of hours, or a 9-hour flight. But wanted to record this as a way to start my debriefing on my trip here through ILI, Intercultural Leadership Institute, as a fellow. There's a lot to break down, there's a lot to share, there's a lot to process, but wanting to start here as a way to make that transition home. So one of the first things I wanted to share is when you get put in a situation where you choose to be in a place where you know you're going to be uncomfortable, that's the first indication that you are growing and you're stretching yourself to experience growth. And I want to just say that it's needed, especially if you feel like you're stagnant in your craft, if you're stagnant in your work, what you're doing, you're stagnant in something mundane, and you're feeling like there's like you're weighted in a space and you can't find joy in what you're doing. One of the first things you might want to do is look for spaces and places and opportunities that's going to open your eyes to things that might not be comfortable, that you're comfortable with, like things that you haven't done before. So for me, ILI and this artist fellowship is kind of what, like, I know what I do and I know my craft and I know why I love it, but being in a program like this forces me to re-evaluate where am I in my process, like where am I in my craft, like where am I in what I do as an artist. Am I just sitting there coasting, or like am I looking for opportunities for growth? And sometimes in that search you'll find, while you're searching for these opportunities, you're actually experiencing self-growth. So first thing I wanted to share and make this video of is stretch yourself to spaces that are uncomfortable, because if it's uncomfortable when you're doing the process, it will be uncomfortable when you enter it, but you'll grow because that's all you can do. And that growth, that little bit of growth that you experience, it's really what you actually am looking for, because you're kind of stagnant in what you're doing. So just wanted to share that, my first takeaway, my first processing of this event, of this fellowship. And yeah, anyways, always keep aloha in your heart, because when you have aloha in your heart, you have more aloha to share with the world. And truly and honestly believe that aloha will save the world one person at a time. So if you can, share aloha with those who deserve your aloha, and always remember to take aloha everywhere you go. This is me in Atlanta, heading home to Honolulu, but by way of Jackson, Mississippi. You guys, ahui ho. Aloha, aloha, aloha everybody. Hope you guys are all doing well out there. Aloha to my warriors out there. Hope you guys are having a great day on this Monday. Coming to you all from good old Keaukaha and Hilo, Hawaii. So part two of my debriefing or self-debriefing on my experience in Jackson, Mississippi, with Sipp Culture, with ILI Intercultural Leadership Institute, and all my fellow artists that I met in person. Much aloha out to all of you. Hope you guys are all recovered. So this is my part two on my self-debriefing in my experience in Jackson, Mississippi, coming from a small Hawaiian homestead community here in Keaukaha, Hawaiʻi. part of my debriefing has a lot to do with self-reflection. And I think at any age and at any part of our careers, or in any capacity that we have an opportunity to self-reflect, it's probably one of the hardest things to do, because you're not going to get one answer. You're not going to get one immediate reply. But the self-reflection is where we start to really break down the components of what is it that we bring to the table in any situation, whether it's a work situation, whether it's a family situation, whether it's a partnership situation. We break down what is it that we bring to the table, and also what is it that we are taking from the experience, right? And we are using that to the best of what we can use it for. So self-reflection for me in this whole process, part of the ILI Fellowship and part of me as a Kanaka Maoli, as an indigenous person to Hawaii, it's not an easy process. Definitely not an easy process, but I think the biggest part for me, now that I'm almost a week returned from my experience, is really understanding what my strengths are and also what my weaknesses are. And I think I found that being in Jackson, Mississippi, being in the ILI Artists Fellowship, and amongst the cohort, and amongst the facilitators, and amongst the founders of the organization, is that I learned to not listen to the voices in my head, but really to listen with a fine tune of what I think in my head was happening, like what I was absorbing, what I wasn't able to absorb, and I realized in this self-reflection coming now that I am home, is that there's so much out there in the world that that you'll never get to see, you'll never get to understand unless you step into it, right? And so for me, this self-reflection has a lot to do with stepping out of my comfort and getting into an uncomfortable space, safe enough, but challenging enough to learn more about what I contribute to the whole as a person, as a Native person, as a artist, as a teacher in the classroom, as a friend amongst friends. Is what do I bring to the whole? Like, this self-reflection process for me after coming back from Jackson, Mississippi, has me thinking about what is it that I'm contributing to the whole, and is what I'm contributing to the whole progressive enough that we can still move the needle from where it was before to a more progressive space where we can question the things that we try not to question, just so that we don't make any waves, right? We try not to question certain things around certain peoples in certain situations, just because we don't know what reactions we'll get, and if we might be offending and in some ways defending certain stigmas, right? So in the self-reflection returning home, I'm realizing I question, like, am I contributing to the whole of my community? Am I contributing to, and am I contributing in a positive way, right? Because you can contribute in a negative way, but am I contributing in a positive way, that I am breaking down some of the status quo issues, some of the asking some of the questions that people have been hesitant to ask. And so in this self-reflection, I started to journal down some of the thoughts that I had as I returned home from this experience. Now, again, this is a very intensive experience. Like, it's called an intensive for a reason. And we have to take everything with a little bit of grain of salt. But it doesn't mean that we have to compromise who we are in the process. Easier said than done, never easy to do, especially when we're talking about ourselves. But if you can, and should you test yourself and should you push yourself to that level, take everything with a grain of salt, because salt can add flavor, and salt can also have a disdain taste, right? So having said that, my self-reflection has been an ongoing process. My self-reflection coming home from Jackson, Mississippi, and being in my first intensive in-person meetup with the ILI fellows, I have learned so much about what aloha means in a space that not everybody understands aloha the way I understand aloha. And I had to walk with grace in that. I had to step with grace in that process. So so this is my part 2 breakdown of what's happening and how I'm debriefing from my fellows meetup in Jackson, Mississippi with Sipp Culture. Much mahalo to Sipp Culture, much mahalo to First People's Funds, much mahalo to NALAC for you guys, and Pa'i Foundation, for sure, Pa'i Foundation, for the dream that you guys set forth a few years ago that has become a fruition for many of us to participate in. So much mahalo and much aloha out to all of those founders and those programs and all of their workers and all of their integral parts that created this opportunity for me as a Native artist to be a part of a diverse and line pushing cohort of magnificent individuals. So mahalo to all of you guys out there. Before I let you guys go, just remember to keep aloha in your heart, because when you have aloha in your heart, you have more aloha to share with the world. And I truly and honestly believe that aloha will save the world one person at a time. So always take aloha with you wherever you go. Aloha and ahuiho. Aloha everybody. Aloha to all my warriors out there, every warrior out there, hoping that this Tuesday is doing good for you. So I wanted to continue on sharing my experience as a artist fellow, Kanaka artist fellow for ILI Institute, Intercultural Leadership Institute. So this will be part 3 of my little breakdown of debriefing and decompressing from the event that I attended in Jackson, Mississippi. Today I kind of wanted to talk about trauma, and I want to say that with as much of aloha as I can, because that word itself can be very triggering, and that word itself can also be very healing. It depends on how you look at it. It depends on the perspective in which you're coming at it, and the perspective that you're leaving with it. So again, the word trauma, and I say this again with as much aloha as I possibly can, because it isn't an easy discussion to have, especially when you're in a group and you're in a setting that has multiple personalities in that setting. You have multiple traumas that can impede into that same space. And these are the hard things to talk about. And it probably because most of us don't actually have dialogue about this. Most of us just kind of deal with the trauma as it is and then figure out how to survive it. Right? You know, I mean, I am a product of that. And I'm trying to, again, be a better ancestor and have these open discussions, if not with anybody else but myself, right? If not with anybody else but myself. So talking about trauma, talking about the perspectives that trauma can bring into situations. And again, it can be a triggering word. It can be devastating for some, but it could also be very healing to go through this process. So let's dig into it. Growing up in Hawaii and being Kanaka and being from a homestead, trauma wasn't necessarily something that was identified as you're growing up, right? As you're being raised in this space, in this place. And I think part of that reason is because of the environment that I was in. Not to say that I didn't have trauma. I just maybe didn't identify it as trauma at the time. And as I got older and as we got exposed to more and more things that the world has to offer, we start to compartmentalize things, right? Oh, you're Native Hawaiian, you belong in this box. You're from the Pacific, you belong in this box. Oh, you're close to Asia, you're Asian Pacific Islanders, you're in this box. You are a fair-skinned Native, so you're in this box. You are often mistaken for not being any kind of Native, you are in this box. So it's compartmentalized based on, again, the environment and then, of course, the personalities that are in the situations. But trauma, as we become adults and as we learn about the world around us, really becomes something that's embedded into our identity, and we don't necessarily recognize it until it's so heavy that it hurts. We don't actually recognize it until it's so heavy that it hurts. And going to different places like Jackson, Mississippi, like BC, Canada, British Columbia, Canada, like Aotearoa, New Zealand, like Tahiti, like Los Angeles, California, until you go to these different places that have very different perspectives on what is accepted and what is not, we don't really realize that the kind of trauma we grew up with is very different across the board depending on the environment that you're in. Now, having said that, that does not mean, nor does it ever denounce that your trauma ain't real, because we all know individually how we deal with trauma, and to strip us away from that as if it doesn't mean anything because it doesn't affect a greater or a bigger community is to say that we don't exist. So let me make that clear. It's not about taking and stripping you away from your own personal trauma. It's identifying that really our traumas are not very different. Now, I say that because in my experience in Jackson, Mississippi, in my experience at Sipp Culture being the host of our ILI Artist Fellowship, what kind of trauma I felt or I was being enveloped in is very similar to what I think I've experienced, not I think, but what I've experienced growing up in my homeland, but in a very different way. And so it made me think, it forced me to put myself outside of my own environment physically and also mentally, right? But more than that, spiritually, I was out of my element. And so I had to find some common ground. And ironically, I found my common ground spiritually dealing with that word trauma. Because everybody that came to the table, everybody, fellows, facilitators, founders, all the different components of every personality that was in this intensive in-person gathering, everybody came with their little bit of trauma. And it was hard to, in a way, at least for me, not speaking for anybody else, but it was hard to hide from that trauma because it's so intense. The emotions are so intense. The gathering is so intense. It's intentional. We're coming into these spaces with the intention to be open and willing to be present. So we all kind of get vulnerable in this trauma, and I have to say it for myself. It was one of the biggest learning experiences of my life. It made me realize that we are no different from each other than maybe the environments that we are in. That every one of us, every little trauma that we've ever dealt with is no different in the group, no different in the team, no different in the social aspect of our gathering. And I walked away realizing that there really is a lot to talk about when it comes to race and culture and identity. But at the end of the day, we are all human. And if we can have compassion for each other, and if we can have a little bit of grace for each other, how much more would the world be a little bit closer to being peaceful than not? That was my experience. I took that away from my experience, and it took me a little bit as I returned home to kind of sift through my emotions. But I came to realize, like, how much more peaceful would this world be if we just had a little bit more compassion, a little bit more grace, as we were all dealing with our own intergenerational trauma, family trauma, religious trauma. We're all dealing with some kind of trauma, and when we can come to a space where we can be okay with the fact that is, some people are coming with more than others in that space. If we can gather, even when we all have our own different personalities, and we can at least leave the space a better human being, we will change the world. We can change the world. We can make the world a little bit better than when we were born into it. So that is my little takeaway. That is my part 3. It can get heavy, but you know what? If it's not heavy, it's not worth it. You don't know it's there, you know? So I leave you guys with that. I hope I shared some insight. I hope I dropped some hana'o and some thoughts for you to think about. Just remember to keep aloha in your heart, because when you have aloha in your heart, you have more aloha to share with the world. And I truly and honestly believe that aloha will save the world, one person at a time. So please, please, always walk with aloha. Ahui ho.